Season 2, Episode 2. Introduction. The COVID-19 pandemic shook the moral foundation of healthcare as the principles of bioethics, routinely defined as autonomy, beneficence, nonmaleficence, and justice, did not serve the demand for a response during a pandemic. These static principles had served healthcare well for decades. They had been effectively assimilated into the moral discourse at all levels of healthcare. Unfortunately, static principles risk failure when the moral climate in healthcare shifts, and pandemics cause dramatic moral shifts. Autonomy, in particular, was not helpful in response to a pandemic. It was too focused on the individual when the moral response demanded a community approach. The practitioner in a COVID-dominated ICU often could not maintain the autonomy of the patient when so many had to be intubated, could not always be confident of doing good as best practices were changing quickly, could not always prevent harm as new treatments were being attempted in many settings, and could not often act fairly when the rooms and hallways were filled with seriously ill patients. A new set of principles was needed, or a different approach. Various healthcare authorities began selecting a new set of moral principles that would assist in a response to new moral demands during a pandemic. Principles that serve the community, such as utility and justice, were typically selected. We will offer a different approach. This work calls for a framework that defines past principles, analyzes present principles, and predicts future principles. This work, and Wholistic Symmetrical Bioethic, will introduce a dynamic set of complementary principles that will assist future responses to a future moral healthcare crisis. This ethic will offer predictable principles in oscillation with their complement. This predictability will offer confidence when a future moral response is needed, and it will be needed. However, to arrive at a better future, we must assess the past, the ancient past. Plato will inform us why we use static principles. Aristotle will teach us about dynamic principles. We must assimilate both effectively and use both to improve the future. Let's begin with Plato. End of introduction. And Wholistic Symmetrical Bioethic. Plato. Master Plato looked puzzled and a little irritated as he scanned his students. As Plato sat under his favorite olive tree in the center of the academy, contemplating his next point, his students waited patiently at his feet. Plato was in the midst of his lecture on Socrates, his mentor, and the virtues, a favorite Greek topic. Plato's ideals, supporting the goal of building the good society, were developing well. Society needed virtuous people, exhibiting the 4 Greek cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. These static virtues are a key ideal for each of the four primary segments of any society. Plato liked to begin with an exploration of wisdom, the key virtue of the guardians or elites, the head of his society. This part of society must offer careful guidance to the city through wise application of their abundant knowledge. Then Plato liked to develop courage, a key virtue of the military, the arms and legs of society. The soldier must rise to the ideal of courage for the society to be defended. During this section, his prize student, Aristotle, raised his hand to offer his question. How does one develop courage in the soldier? After a moment of silence, Plato restated his premise. One must live with the drive towards preserving the society as it is, its laws and opinions. That is courage. Aristotle was unsatisfied. He wanted a more practical answer, a more flexible answer, and a less static answer. Choosing the mean between extremes, another of Plato's teachings, seemed more appropriate to Aristotle. His later work in ethics on the dynamic development of virtues would go on to serve humanity well. His response to static virtues continues to reach into the ages. Other philosophers also struggle with practical questions to static moral frameworks. Beecham and Childress. Two philosophers of the 20th century healthcare, Tom Beecham and James Childress, seem to be a bit irritated. The questions about their principles keep coming. In their text, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, now in its 8th edition through Oxford University Press, Beecham and Childress offer their vision of the ideals of healthcare. They develop 4 static principles for effective healthcare: autonomy, nonmaleficence, beneficence, and justice. Beecham and Childress's success in defining the moral foundation of healthcare is profound. Medical students are often expected to memorize these principles. Their recitation has been coined the med school mantra. The moral landscape of hospitals has shifted so that these once paternalistic and emotionally detached institutions are now fertile places for the implementation of patient-centered care aligned towards the ideal of a patient's autonomy. Hospital ethics committees across the land punctuated their ethics case studies with these 4 principles as their primary talking points. Beecham and Childress seem to have won the moral philosophical arguments of what should dominate within a healthy healthcare institution. However, the seeds of discontent over autonomy and other principles continue to sprout. Questions about autonomy arise often. An overemphasis on autonomy seems to be unhealthy. A pandemic caused by a virus demands a different response. A redirection is now underway. Dr. Williams, an admirer of Beecham and Childress's work, raises his hand and asks 3 questions. What do we do when autonomy seems only useful to individuals in the healthcare system and not the community? Why would we idealize self-centeredness, a result of autonomy, when our communities need other-centeredness, the goal of many religious and service traditions to solve pandemic-related problems? And how do we shift to community-centered care during a pandemic? Plato's student Aristotle found some answers. Aristotle might help us find an ancient pathway that we can transform anew. End of episode 2. Our next episode will explore Aristotle.